So as promised, in this video, we're going to consider what causes changes in macroeconomic equilibrium in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And we're going to think about what the consequences of those changes may be as measured by our three primary macroeconomic indicators of GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So I think that this video is important because this is going to allow you to understand the framework for predicting changes in macroeconomic conditions due to changes in underlying market forces. And so it'll allow you to be able to make educated guesses about what is going to happen to unemployment, inflation, or the size of our economy, which may have relevance for business decisions that you may have in your careers in response to underlying changes throughout the economy that you may be privy to or may be reading in the news. And so this is also going to allow you to better understand which types of market forces are likely to lead to beneficial changes in the macroeconomy and why, as well as allowing you to better predict changes in macroeconomic indicators when confronted with changes in market conditions, which is an end goal of this course. So we're going to think that the entire short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift in response to changes in productivity growth and costs of inputs, as well as other shocks which impact production. And so when we think about changes in productivity growth, we want to think about really, I guess, how for both of these, how closely related they are to the market forces which lead to changes in supply and the microeconomic model of supply and demand. That when we have an increase in the price of an input, then we have a leftward shift in the supply curve in that market. And so in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we don't necessarily think of individual inputs increasing in price and having an impact on the equilibrium throughout the economy. We think of more aggregated inputs such as the price of labor. So not necessarily thinking about the price of one type of worker that maybe painters or pipe fitters now get paid a higher price level, but that labor throughout the economy is going to get paid a higher wage, or that we are now paying a higher price for certain types of energy, that if there is a gasoline shortage or a crude oil shortage, that we're going to have a contraction in our short-run aggregate supply. So we would notice that by a leftward shift in our short-run aggregate supply, which would then cause our equilibrium to shift to the left, decreasing the size of our economy as measured by real GDP and increasing the price level. So we see the same combination of outcomes as we saw in a supply and demand model, that prices go up, quantity goes down, and this means in this case that there is inflation and contraction. And it's important to notice that when only the cost of inputs change, that it doesn't impact our long-run aggregate supply. That long-run aggregate supply is going to only change in response to our productive capacity and our amount of labor, technology, and capital, not in response to the prices in the economy. On the other hand, when we have productivity growth, maybe due to a new technology or a new system of organizing production, such as the assembly lines in the early 20th century, then not only do we increase our short-run aggregate supply and shift our short-run equilibrium to the right, but we also shift our long-run aggregate supply and thus shift our potential GDP, our full employment GDP, and increase the total long-run capacity for our economy to exist at equilibrium. And so it's important to note that all of these changes are holding aggregate demand constant, that if aggregate demand were to shift as well, that these conditions may not hold based on the direction in which aggregate demand shifts. So looking at what factors cause aggregate demand to shift, we're going to think about two primary sets of factors. So anything that changes the behavior of consumers and firms, possibly of changes in entrepreneurial confidence or expectations about the future of the economy, or changes in taxes and government spending. That we're not going to think of price levels, changes in price levels, as causing a shift in the entire aggregate demand curve. Instead, that would cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve, just as we think about shifts and movements in a private goods market or a microeconomic market. But we're going to think about the entire curve shifting in response to the behavior at large of consumers and firms or taxes and government spending. So if we were to think of our measure of GDP of y equals c plus I plus g minus t plus x minus m, that anything that would cause this to increase would lead to a case where we have an increase in aggregate demand, which thus is expansionary and inflationary, and the level to which it's inflationary depends on whether we're looking at an intersection with the short-run aggregate supply curve in the flat part of the short-run aggregate supply curve or the steeper part. And anything that causes anything on the right-hand side of this equation to decrease, or that causes the right-hand side to decrease, will also cause a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve, which would then be contractionary and deflationary. So once again, the probably easiest difference, easiest variables to look at here are government spending and taxes. That when we increase government spending, that is going to boost the economy, which is part of the reason why it's called a stimulus. It's going to stimulate growth when we have more government spending, such as everybody in the country being cut a $1,200 check. Or when we increase taxes, that's going to put less money in the hands of consumers to be able to spend, and so that's going to decrease the total economic activity in the economy. So when we think back to what the four types of changes in a microeconomic supply and demand model would be with regard to supply and demand, we could either have an increase in demand or a decrease in demand, or an increase in supply or a decrease in supply. And that based on those outcomes or those types of changes, we can either see price increase and quantity decrease. We can see price increase and quantity increase. We can see price decrease and quantity decrease, or we could see price, whoops, wrong color there, price decrease and quantity increase. And so this is obviously going to have an analog in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model as well, but it's really helpful, I think, for you all to be familiar with what those combinations would be due to a shift in one of the curves. So as alluded to, we can think of the same types of shifts in the macroeconomic model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, where we have an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve, so SRAS up. We have a decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve, SRAS down. We have an increase in the aggregate demand curve, so AD up, and we have a decrease in the aggregate demand curve, AD down. And that's obviously going to come with its own set of combinations of macroeconomic indicators, which we'll look at here on the next slide. So when we hold the other curve constant, when we have an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve, then we're going to have prices decrease. We're going to have GDP increase, and we're going to assume that unemployment is going to move in the opposite direction, so unemployment is going to decrease. This is generally a good thing, that we think that deflation can be harmful, but only insofar as it's related to a recession. That when there's a recession, deflation is harmful because it provides the incentive for people to wait to spend their money until prices drop further. And so there's always that perpetual incentive to decrease your consumption, which is going to lead to this perpetual self-reinforcing mechanism of further deflation and further recession. However, when we have economic expansion, when we have growth, then decreasing prices are generally a good thing. So anything that we can do to increase our short-run aggregate supply curve and simultaneously our long-run aggregate supply curve is a good thing, which is why you see such an emphasis on research and development and technology and government investment in those types of pursuits. On the other hand, a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to be inflationary and contractionary. So it's going to cause unemployment to increase and growth to stall or decrease, all while we're paying higher prices. And so this is really one of the worst possible outcomes, as the tools at our disposal are going to be limited, and we're going to be facing a monster from both ends here. When we have an increase in aggregate demand, we're going to have a price increase. It's just a matter of how much price is going to increase, and it's going to depend on whether we're at the steep part of the short-run aggregate supply curve or the flat part. We're going to have an increase in growth and a decrease in unemployment. And on the other hand, when we have a decrease in aggregate demand, prices are going to fall, but that's going to be associated with a recession or a decrease in GDP, as well as joblessness in the economy. So while there's a couple more notes I'd like to make about those potential changes in equilibrium due to a shift in one of the curves, specifically that just like in the private supply and demand microeconomics models, we can also have ambiguous effects on equilibrium if there are multiple changes in the curves, and that inflation may be long-lasting if there are expectations that inflation is going to increase in the future. I also right now want to move on to applying those shifts to some historical examples of shifts in our macroeconomic equilibrium to show how we can use this model to predict and understand changes in our economy. So the Great Depression has typically been thought of or proposed to be understood as a case in which there was insufficient aggregate demand, which spread through the economy and provided a contractionary and, in this case, depression-leading cycle. And so it was, yes, it's helpful to think of the Great Depression as a case in which aggregate demand decreased, and this led to a decrease in real GDP. So not only in nominal GDP, because prices were falling, but in the actual value of what was being produced, as well as a deflationary effect on prices in the economy. So what could get us out of the Great Depression? Well, as we said earlier, government spending can increase aggregate demand if we hold taxes constant and we inject stimulus into the economy. And so that's part of what helped us get out of the Great Depression was the public works programs, the New Deal programs, which were implemented by FDR. And there is definitely historical evidence that I can point you in the direction of if that's something that you'd like to explore in more detail or that you question whether or not that actually happened. I know conservative commentator Ben Shapiro is skeptical of this, but there's been significant research done by economic historians and economists that suggest that these New Deal policies were effective. However, it's hard to know whether these were the factors which got us out of the Great Depression or whether there was another factor which had more of a significant impact on aggregate demand, which was able to increase price levels and increase real output. And you all probably know where I'm going with this, but that shock to our economy, which increased aggregate demand, was the Second World War. So Second World War was a pretty much the epitome of an increase in aggregate demand that would increase both price levels and economic output. And this is because at that point in time, we had not only an increase in employment. Remember that unemployment moves in the opposite direction of output. And so unemployment would decrease as economic output increases. And this is because while we were previously living in an economy which was recovering from the Great Depression and jobs were harder to find, now any able-bodied working age male was going to be employed in the war effort, either fighting abroad or farming or working in a factory. And women, which were previously not part of the labor market, were now pulled in to work in the factories as well. Think of your, Rosie the Riveters. And so we saw a massive increase in the government spending, which was necessary to support the war effort, to pay for that labor, pay for those jobs, as well as pay for research and development and pay for the materials for the war effort. And so we have a massive increase in government spending, which causes aggregate demand increase, which combated some of the lingering effects of the Great Depression. So it was expansionary and inflationary. So on the other hand, we can also think of shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve as being recessionary as well, as leading to a depression or a recession. And so one of the name that's been given to this type of shock is stagflation. So stagflation is a portmanteau, so meaning a combination of two words. So the example I always like to give for a portmanteau is a freakend, a free weekend. You combine those two and you have a freakend. And this is a portmanteau of stagnant and inflation. And so this term was used to describe the economy of the 1970s, in which case we had stalling growth or contractionary economy in addition to high inflationary pressures. And so this was largely caused, in part at least, by a shock to oil prices that due to OPEC and restrictions on oil, that the price went up significantly. And seeing that oil is such a significant input into production in the US, as the price of a primary input into production increased, then we had a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve, which then led to a reduction in economic output, as well as an increase in price levels in the economy. And this led to all kinds of, I think, odd policy recommendations. Like, I think gas stations were closed on Sundays for part of this as a way to encourage people not to drive. And so as to decrease the demand for oil, which would then bring the prices back down, or at least prevent the prices from running away. But before the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, there's a hard way to predict this type of shock to the economy, because the Keynesian cross model would say that if there's inflation, then we should have expansion. However, in this case, we can see that not only do we have inflation, but we're going to have higher levels of unemployment and lower levels of growth to boot. And so I really wish, if this were a class, I would absolutely show you a video of the best old school hip hop song about stagflation. And I guess I should pause for you to even think about that, or use any of your knowledge about old school hip hop to see if you could think about what this song would be. But instead of showing the video, I'll just tell you what it is. So it's The Message by Grandmaster Flash. And if you listen to like the first minute of the song, he says, "I've got a bum education, double-digit inflation, can't take a train to the job, there's a strike at the station." And yeah, the whole song is just about the economy of the late 70s, early 80s, in which case they were dealing with inflation, which your generation and my generation really hasn't had to deal with, as well as stalling economic growth, which we certainly have had to over a couple period of time. However, just as we can see that a decrease in short-run aggregate supply could lead to a suboptimal outcome, we can think about an increase in short-run aggregate supply leading to a positive outcome. And that positive outcome would be a case where we would have an increase in the short-run aggregate supply, which would lead to lower prices and greater output, or correlated with that greater output would be lower levels of unemployment. And so this is part of what we saw in the dot-com boom, the tech boom of the late 90s, where we saw offers being made to homemakers which were out of the labor market for periods of years, to draw them back into the labor market. And so obviously when firms are competing over employees, then that's a good sign for the economy, that there is enough desire to produce and enough of an incentive to produce that they are willing to pay more for labor than they otherwise would be. And so this is what we saw in the late 90s with, in general, prices it becoming cheaper to produce goods and services, while at the same time expanding our capacity for output, and actually having one of the few periods in which we had a budget surplus. So we collected more in tax revenue than we spent in government spending, which led to this seemingly now kind of bizarro world where, leading up to the 2000 presidential election, the candidates were all asked, what are you going to do with the budget surplus? And there was discussions about paying down the national debt, about giving tax cuts, and that's ultimately the candidate who won by 500 votes in Florida. If any of you aren't aware of this, this is the reason why you vote, because votes have consequences. And if 500 people in Florida would have voted differently, then we probably don't go to war with Iraq. And however you feel about that, whether that was a just war or not, I feel like it's less ambiguous that it would have happened had there been a different commander-in-chief in charge. And so elections have consequences. Your vote matters, and there's probably things that were better to do with that government surplus than to than to offer tax cuts for the top of the income distribution. But that's a talk for another matter. So in the next video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model fundamentals, discuss how it's related to both the neoclassical vision of the economy as well as the Keynesian vision of the economy. And then we're going to move on to discuss some practice problems so that you can put this knowledge into practice, I guess.